I heard my daughter-in-law whisper, "We'll have to figure out how to support her now." As if I wasn't standing 3 feet away, as if I had already become a problem to solve instead of a person who had just buried her husband of 42 years. I didn't correct her. Not about the $28 million. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of quiet that feels respectful from a distance, but hollow when you're the one sitting in the front row alone. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers still, posture straight, the way I had learned over decades of standing beside my husband at events where appearances mattered more than feelings. People walked past me with soft voices and careful expressions, offering condolences that felt rehearsed, their eyes sliding past mine just a second too quickly, as if grief had made me invisible. Vanessa stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a composed smile, her black dress perfectly tailored, her voice steady, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as though she were the one holding everything together. My son nodded along, saying thank you, accepting sympathy, never once looking back at me. I noticed the way decisions moved around me, not through me. The pastor confirmed details with Vanessa. The funeral director checked timelines with Daniel. Even the seating chart had been adjusted without a word to me, placing me slightly off-center, just enough that anyone paying attention would understand I was no longer the axis of this family. I didn't say anything. I simply observed. A woman I barely recognized leaned over and said, "It must be overwhelming, dealing with everything on your own now." Her tone gentle but final, like a conclusion already reached. I gave her a small nod. I let her believe it. Across the room, I caught fragments of conversation. Expenses, property, what would happen next? Vanessa's voice lowered, but not enough. "The house is too much for her," she said softly, though her eyes were sharp, calculating. "We'll need to make some decisions soon." Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded, the same way he used to when he was a boy trying to avoid conflict, except now that silence carried a different weight. I felt it settle in the space between us, heavier than any words he could have spoken. I turned my gaze back to the closed casket at the front of the room, remembering the man who had never once let me feel small, who had built everything we had side by side with me, never above me, never ahead of me. The memory didn't break me. It steadied me. Because what no one in that room understood, what none of them had even considered, was that I had already seen this shift coming. The distance. The quiet rearranging of roles. The assumption that without him, I would somehow shrink. I had let it happen. I had let them believe it. I sat there, still and composed, while they planned a future that didn't include my voice, and I realized something with absolute clarity. They weren't just underestimating me. They were building their entire plan on that mistake. The house felt different when I walked back in that evening, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. The air was still, the kind of silence that settles after people leave, but does not quite belong to peace. I set my purse down on the narrow table by the door, the same table Daniel used to drop his school books on when he was 10, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No one asking if I needed anything. I moved through the living room slowly, my heels soft against the hardwood floors, past the photographs arranged along the mantel. There was one of Daniel at graduation, one of our anniversary in Napa Valley, one of my husband standing beside the first car he ever bought with his own money. I paused there, just for a second, studying the way he had smiled in that picture. Confident. Certain. Never once unsure of where he stood or who stood beside him. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, though it did not need adjusting. It was something to do with my hands. Something to keep them steady. From the kitchen, I could still hear the faint echo of voices from earlier that day, replaying in my mind with a clarity that felt almost deliberate. Vanessa's tone, measured and practical, discussing timelines as if grief had a schedule. Daniel agreeing, quietly, without resistance, as though he had already accepted a version of the future where I was no longer central. I opened the refrigerator, looked inside without really seeing anything, then closed it again. I was not hungry. I had not been hungry since the moment I realized that the way they looked at me had shifted from concern to calculation. It was subtle, almost polite, but unmistakable. I walked into the study, the one room in the house that still felt entirely mine, and sat down in the leather chair by the window. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the desk where my husband used to review documents late into the night. I remembered how he would call me in sometimes, asking my opinion, listening carefully, always treating my thoughts as equal to his own. That had been our rhythm, our understanding. And somewhere along the way, after he was gone, that understanding had been quietly erased from everyone else's memory. I folded my hands together and let the silence settle again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt clarifying, because piece by piece, moment by moment, everything I had witnessed that day began to align. The seating arrangement, the conversations, the assumptions, none of it had been accidental. It had been a quiet repositioning, a gradual shifting of power that they believed I had not noticed. But I had noticed. I had simply chosen not to respond. Not yet. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself one slow breath, steady and controlled, the way I had learned to manage far more complicated situations than this. Because grief may have brought me to that chapel, but it was not the only thing I carried with me. There was something else now, something colder and far more precise. Understanding. And with that understanding came a kind of patience I had not needed in years. I did not have to rush. I did not have to argue. I only had to wait and watch and let them continue believing exactly what they wanted to believe. The next morning, the house was no longer quiet in the same way, because this time the silence was interrupted by purpose. I heard the front door open just after 9, followed by the sound of measured footsteps that did not belong to grief but to routine, to people who had already begun moving forward. Vanessa's voice carried first, light and controlled, discussing something about schedules and calls, while Daniel responded in short, agreeable sentences that told me more about his state of mind than any long explanation ever could. I did not rush to greet them. Instead, I remained seated in the study, the door slightly open, allowing their words to drift in without announcing my presence. "We should not wait too long," Vanessa said, her tone careful but firm. "The longer things sit, the more complicated it becomes." There was a pause, and then Daniel spoke, quieter than hers, but not resistant. "I know. I just want to make sure it is handled right." Handled right. I let the phrase settle. It sounded responsible. It sounded thoughtful, but it did not include me. I rose slowly from the chair and stepped into the hallway just as they moved toward the kitchen, both of them stopping for a fraction of a second when they saw me, their expressions adjusting almost instantly into something softer, something more appropriate. "Mom," Daniel said, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "How are you feeling this morning?" It was a simple question, the kind people ask out of habit, not curiosity. "I am fine," I replied, my voice even, my posture unchanged. Vanessa gave a sympathetic nod, stepping slightly closer, but not too close, maintaining a distance that felt intentional. "We were just talking about some of the practical things," she said, her words gentle, as though explaining something to someone fragile. "There are a few decisions that will need to be made in the next couple of weeks." I looked at her, then at Daniel, allowing a brief pause to stretch between us. "Of course," I said. "There always are." Neither of them elaborated. They did not ask for my opinion. They did not invite me into the conversation. Instead, Vanessa turned slightly toward Daniel again, continuing as though I had simply acknowledged what had already been decided. "The house is quite large," she said, "and maintaining it alone might be overwhelming. We should start looking at options that make more sense long-term." Options. I recognized the word for what it was. A way of softening an outcome that had already been chosen. Daniel nodded again, slower this time, his gaze briefly flickering toward me before settling back on her. "We will figure it out," he said. I watched them for a moment longer, taking in the ease with which they spoke about my life as if it were a logistical problem, something to be reorganized, simplified, adjusted. Then I gave a small nod of my own, the kind that signals agreement without commitment. "I am sure you will," I said calmly. Vanessa smiled, satisfied, and turned back to the counter, reaching for her phone as if the matter had been settled. Daniel lingered for a second, as though he might say something more, but the moment passed, and he followed her lead. I did not stay in the kitchen. I did not need to. I had heard enough. As I walked back down the hallway, I noticed how easily they had stepped into this new dynamic, how naturally they had begun making decisions without me, convinced that I would simply accept whatever was arranged. It was not cruelty in the way people often imagine it. It was quieter than that, more efficient. They had already placed me in a role, and now they were acting accordingly. I returned to the study and closed the door gently behind me, not out of exclusion, but out of clarity. Because what they did not realize, what they had not even considered, was that every word they spoke, every assumption they made, only confirmed what I had begun to understand the day before. They were not waiting to see what I would do. They believed there was nothing left for me to do. And that belief, more than anything else, was the foundation of everything they were about to lose. I did not confront them that day, or the day after, because there was nothing to confront yet, only patterns that had finally become too clear to ignore. Instead, I found myself drifting through the house with a different kind of awareness, noticing details I had once overlooked because I had trusted too easily. The way Vanessa reorganized the kitchen drawers without asking, replacing familiar placements with her own logic. The way Daniel no longer lingered in conversation, as if time spent with me had quietly become an obligation rather than a choice. Small things. Easy to dismiss if you were not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. I paused in the hallway outside our bedroom, the door still half open from the morning, and stepped inside slowly, letting my eyes move across the space that had once felt like the center of everything. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn just enough to soften the sunlight, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. I walked to the dresser and rested my hand lightly on the polished wood, remembering the years when this room had been a place of shared decisions, late-night conversations, quiet laughter over things that only the two of us understood. We had built more than a life here. We had built stability, intention, something deliberate and lasting. And I had been part of every step. I had not stood behind him. I had stood beside him. That was something no one else seemed to remember anymore. I opened the top drawer and found the folder where he used to keep documents, papers he would review with careful attention, often asking me to sit with him while he explained the details. Not because I needed to understand, but because he believed I should. I did not take anything out. I did not need to. Just knowing it was there was enough. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa speaking again, her voice carrying that same measured tone, discussing appointments, timelines, arrangements that continued to move forward without me. I closed the drawer gently and sat on the edge of the bed, letting my hands rest calmly in my lap. There was no anger in what I felt. No sharp reaction. Just a steady realization that the version of me they had already accepted was incomplete, and more importantly, inaccurate. They had mistaken silence for absence. They had mistaken composure for weakness. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the details that had once defined my role here, and then I stood, smoothing the front of my blouse as I moved toward the door. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are unobserved, when they assume the outcome is already decided. And that was exactly where Vanessa and Daniel were now. Certain, comfortable, unquestioning. I stepped back into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind me, and for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible shift in perspective. They believed they were preparing me for what came next. In truth, they were preparing themselves. It was later that afternoon when I heard it clearly, not softened by distance or disguised by polite tone, but spoken plainly enough that there was no room left for interpretation. I had stepped into the hallway just as Vanessa's voice carried from the living room, low but steady, the kind of voice people use when they believe they are being practical. If we list the house within the next 30 days, we can avoid unnecessary costs, she said. And it would be easier to transition her somewhere smaller before winter. Somewhere smaller. I paused where I stood, not out of shock, but because I wanted to hear the rest without interruption. Daniel responded, quieter, but not disagreeing. We just have to make sure it is done smoothly, he said. I do not want this to turn into something difficult. Difficult. I let the word settle in my mind. Not painful, not unfair, just inconvenient. Vanessa continued, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. It will not be, as long as we approach it the right way. We frame it as support, as something that benefits her, benefits me. I felt something shift then, not sharp or overwhelming, but precise, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. They were not reacting to a situation. They were shaping it. Every word, every step, carefully positioned to create a narrative where I would eventually agree with decisions that had already been made without me. I remained still, allowing the conversation to continue, absorbing each detail the way I had learned to do in rooms where listening mattered more than speaking. There are excellent senior communities nearby, Vanessa added. Places with amenities, people her age, everything she would need. It would be better than her staying here alone. Alone. The word lingered, though I knew it was not meant as comfort. It was justification. Daniel hesitated this time, just slightly. We should talk to her first, he said. We cannot just decide everything. For a moment, I almost believed he might push back, that some part of him still recognized the line they were approaching. But Vanessa's response came quickly, smooth, and reassuring. Of course we will talk to her, she said. But we should already know what we are suggesting before we do. That way it feels organized, not reactive. Organized. Planned. Final. I stepped back quietly before either of them could notice me, returning to the study with the same measured pace I had maintained all day. Once inside, I closed the door gently and sat down, letting my hands rest on the desk as the weight of what I had heard settled into something solid, something undeniable. There it was. Not suspicion, not interpretation. A clear outline of what they intended to do. Sell the house. Relocate me. Restructure everything in a way that made sense for them, while presenting it as care for me. I did not feel anger. I did not feel hurt in the way I might have years ago. What I felt was clarity. A clean, unmistakable understanding of where I stood in their plans. And more importantly, where they stood in mine. Because as thorough as their discussion had been, as carefully as they had mapped out the future they believed was coming, there was one detail they had not accounted for. Not once in that entire conversation had they questioned whether they had the authority to make those decisions. They had simply assumed it. And that assumption, quiet as it was, would be the one thing they would not be able to recover from. The following morning arrived with a kind of quiet certainty that felt almost unfamiliar, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I no longer needed to question what I was seeing beneath it. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blouse and a pair of slacks that had always made me feel composed, then made my way to the kitchen where Vanessa was already standing by the counter, scrolling through her phone while a pot of coffee brewed behind her. She looked up briefly when I entered, offering a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, controlled, as if everything was proceeding exactly as expected. "Good morning," I replied, moving past her to pour myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady, my movements unhurried. Daniel entered a moment later, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, already halfway into his day, his attention divided between us and whatever responsibilities were waiting outside the house. "Mom," he said, nodding toward me. "I was thinking we could sit down later today and talk through some things. Just to make sure everything is clear." Clear. The word lingered, familiar now in the way. They used it to soften decisions that had already been made. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding. "That sounds reasonable," I said calmly, meeting his gaze just long enough to acknowledge the invitation without giving anything away. Vanessa set her phone down then, stepping slightly closer, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled concern. "We just want to make sure you are comfortable," she added. "There are options that could really improve your quality of life." Improve. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded once, as though considering it. "I appreciate that," I said. And I did, just not in the way she intended. The conversation ended there, not because it was complete, but because they believed it was moving exactly as planned. Daniel left first, grabbing his keys, offering a brief goodbye that felt more like routine than connection. Vanessa lingered a moment longer, watching me with a quiet sense of control before returning her attention to her phone, already shifting her focus to the next step in whatever timeline she had constructed. I finished my coffee in silence, then returned to the study, closing the door behind me with the same gentle precision I had maintained since the funeral. The room felt different now, not because of what it contained, but because of what I understood. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer I had touched the day before, this time lifting the folder inside and placing it carefully on the surface in front of me. My husband had always believed in preparation, in clarity, in making sure that when the time came, there would be no confusion about what belonged where or to whom. I opened the folder slowly, scanning the familiar documents, the signatures, the dates, the structure he had put in place long before any of this unfolded. Everything was there, exactly as it should be, exactly as we had discussed. I closed the folder again, not because I had learned something new, but because I had confirmed what I already knew. Then I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had not needed to call in some time. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, steady and professional. "Harrison and Cole," he said. I allowed a brief pause before speaking, my tone even, controlled, and unmistakably certain. "This is Margaret Collins," I said. "I believe it. It's time we had a conversation." The meeting was scheduled for early afternoon, set with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from people who are used to handling matters without delay, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was uncertain, but because I preferred to be settled before anything important began. The office had not changed in years, the same polished wood, the same muted lighting, the same sense of order that had always reassured my husband. Mr. Harrison stood as I entered, his posture straight, his expression respectful in a way that did not need to be exaggerated. "Mrs. Collins," he said, extending his hand. "I am very sorry for your loss." I nodded once, accepting the gesture without lingering on it. "Thank you," I replied, taking the seat across from his desk. There was no small talk after that, no unnecessary softening of the moment. He opened a folder, his movements precise, and looked at me with the kind of directness that signaled he understood exactly why I had called. "You mentioned on the phone that you wanted to review the current structure," he said. I held his gaze for a moment, then spoke evenly. "I want to confirm that everything is still exactly as it was arranged." He nodded without hesitation. "It is," he said. "Your husband was very clear. There have been no changes." I let the words settle, not because I doubted them, but because hearing them spoken aloud had a certain finality to it. "And the primary control," I continued, my tone calm, measured, "remains with me." "Yes," he replied. "Entirely." There was no ambiguity in his voice, no room for interpretation. I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing a brief pause to pass between us, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration. Because what I was confirming was not just legal structure. It was position, authority, reality. "Have there been any inquiries?" I asked, "from anyone else?" Mr. Harrison's expression shifted just slightly, not into discomfort, but into careful awareness. "No formal inquiries," he said. "But there have been assumptions, as there often are in situations like this." I allowed myself the smallest acknowledgement of that, a faint nod that did not require elaboration. "Of course there have," I said. He closed the folder then, resting his hands lightly on the desk. "If I may," he added, "it would be advisable to address those assumptions sooner rather than later. Not to create conflict, but to prevent misunderstandings from becoming complicated." Complicated. The same word Daniel had used. I almost smiled, though nothing in my expression changed. "I agree," I said. "But timing matters." Mr. Harrison inclined his head slightly, understanding without needing further explanation. The meeting concluded shortly after that, not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything that needed to be confirmed had already been made clear. As I stepped outside, the afternoon air felt sharper, more defined, as if the world itself had shifted into clearer focus. I walked to my car without rushing, my steps steady, my thoughts aligned in a way they had not been just days before. Because now there was no uncertainty left. No question of where things stood. Only the quiet recognition that while others had been planning a future based on assumptions, I had just confirmed the truth that would undo all of them. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of relief, but of readiness, because whatever came next would not be shaped by what they believed, but by what I had already decided. When I returned home, the house no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, but a stage where every role had already been assigned, and the only thing left was to decide when the performance would end. Vanessa was seated at the dining table with a laptop open in front of her, papers spread neatly to one side, her posture composed, her expression focused in a way that suggested progress. Daniel stood near the window, his back partially turned, his phone in his hand, his attention divided between whatever message he was reading and the conversation that was clearly already underway. They both looked up when I entered, their movements brief, controlled, as though they had rehearsed this moment without realizing it. "You are back," Vanessa said, offering a small smile, her tone pleasant, almost warm. "We were just going over a few options." "Options again," I set my purse down and took a seat at the table without asking, positioning myself directly across from her, not as an interruption, but as a presence that could no longer be overlooked. That sounds productive, I said calmly, folding my hands in front of me. Daniel shifted slightly, as though unsure whether to speak first, but Vanessa continued, her confidence steady. We have been looking into some communities nearby, she said, turning the laptop slightly so that the screen faced me, displaying images of manicured lawns, smiling residents, carefully staged comfort. They offer excellent care, social activities, and everything you would need to feel supported. I glanced at the screen for only a moment before returning my gaze to her. I see, I said. My voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It remained exactly as it had been all day. Even. Measured. Vanessa nodded, encouraged by the lack of resistance. We think it would be a wonderful transition, she added, especially given how much space this house requires. It is simply too much for one person. Daniel finally spoke then, his tone quieter, more tentative. We just want to make sure you are taken care of, Mom. Taken care of. I held his gaze for a brief second, long enough to let the weight of the phrase settle between us. Of course you do, I replied. There was a pause after that, subtle but noticeable, as if something in my tone had shifted just enough to register without being fully understood. Vanessa cleared her throat lightly and continued, her voice smoothing over the moment. We have also spoken to a realtor, she said, just to get an idea of the market. If we move quickly, we could secure a very strong offer. If we move quickly, I let the words repeat in my mind, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed exactly how far they had already gone without me. You have been very thorough, I said, allowing a faint acknowledgement that sounded almost like approval. Vanessa smiled at that, satisfied, while Daniel looked at me more carefully now, as though trying to determine whether he had missed something. I leaned back slightly in my chair, maintaining the same calm composure I had carried since the funeral, and for a moment, I said nothing at all. I let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the atmosphere, just enough to remind them that I was not absent from this conversation, only patient within it. Because what they still did not understand, even now as they laid out their plans in front of me with quiet confidence, was that every step they believed they were taking forward was built on a foundation that did not belong to them. And the moment that foundation was revealed, everything they had carefully arranged would no longer hold. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, her fingers lightly tapping against the edge of the laptop as if she needed to fill the space before it shifted too far beyond her control. We can start scheduling visits this week, she said, her tone confident again, reclaiming the rhythm she preferred. It would be good to move forward while everything is still fresh. Daniel nodded, slower this time, his eyes flickering between her and me, searching for something he could not quite name. I let a moment pass before I spoke, not out of hesitation, but because timing mattered more than volume. That will not be necessary, I said calmly. My voice was steady, quiet, and absolute in a way that made both of them pause without fully understanding why. Vanessa's expression shifted first, just slightly, the kind of adjustment that happens when a plan encounters unexpected resistance. I am not sure I understand, she replied, her tone still polite, but no longer entirely certain. I met her gaze without raising my voice, without changing my posture, without offering anything that could be mistaken for emotion. You understand perfectly, I said. Daniel straightened a little, his attention now fully on me, the uncertainty in his expression beginning to sharpen into something closer to concern. Mom, he said carefully, we are just trying to help. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. I am aware, I replied, and I appreciate the effort. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching across the table like something tangible. Vanessa closed the laptop slowly, her movements controlled, deliberate, as though she were recalibrating. Then perhaps we should talk through this together, she said, her voice softer now, more measured. We want to make sure everyone is on the same page. I allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch my expression, not warm, not cold, just present. That is exactly what we are going to do, I said. I reached into my bag then, not hurried, not dramatic, and placed a single folder on the table between us. It was the same folder I had reviewed earlier, the same one my husband and I had discussed years ago. With careful clarity and intention, I did not open it immediately. I simply rested my hand on top of it, letting the moment settle before continuing. There seems to be some confusion about what decisions can be made, I said, my tone even, precise. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder now, while Vanessa remained still, her expression composed but no longer entirely controlled. And I think it is important that we clear that up before any further plans are made. I opened the folder then, turning it just enough for them to see the documents inside, the signatures, the structure, the unmistakable clarity of what had been established long before any of this began. I did not rush through it. I did not explain more than necessary. I simply let the information exist in front of them, undeniable in its presence. Daniel's expression changed first, confusion giving way to realization, his posture shifting as the assumptions he had been holding onto began to unravel. Vanessa's reaction was quieter, more contained, but no less significant, her stillness no longer confidence, but calculation. I closed the folder gently after a moment, placing my hand back on top of it, steady and certain. The house is not yours to list, I said, and my future is not yours to arrange. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The room was silent again, but this time it was not the silence of assumption or control. It was the silence that follows the end of something that had only ever existed because no one had challenged it. I looked at both of them, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. You were making plans, I added quietly, without realizing you were not part of them.